One thing I've learned is that most people can read much more quickly than I can speak, so I will give you very brief introductions, and then we can be on our way. And if you want more detail, we will begin with, just to my right, Dan Mazmanian, who is a political scientist, and as you will see, we have quite a diverse panel in terms of disciplines. And he's the former dean of our school, and now he's the head of the Bedrosian Center for Governance at the School of Policy, Planning, and Development. Just to his right is Don Paul, who is a Earth Sciences PhD from MIT, and for many years worked for Chevron, and now is the head of the USC Energy Institute. Just to his right is Adam Rose, an economist here at the School of Policy, Planning, and Development, and with CREATE, our Center for, now I'm going to research on
risk and economic analysis of terrorism events.
And to his right is our second economist, so the economists are still weighing us down a little heavily, is Matt Kahn from UCLA. We're going to be talking about a very heady topic about carbon and energy pricing and social equity. The entire concern about greenhouse gases and global warming and climate change really poses some of the most significant problems that you can face in public policy. It's a public good, so that you have an enormous problem of collective action of who's going to make the reductions and all these incentives to shirk and to let someone else make reductions, and then you can still benefit from their reductions. There's a range of equity issues that we're going to be talking to that can hinder the implementation of any single plan. And the third thing which makes this incredibly complicated, all the benefits occur in the future, and very likely very far in the future, while a lot of the costs occur very soon. These are three aspects: equity, problems with collective choice and public goods, and problems with planning for the future are the things that we have the most difficulty with in the policy world, and they're all wrapped up into one beautiful problem. This is an area where there's a lot of activity right now. There are a number of efforts to start with cap and trade programs regionally in Europe and in different parts in North America. There are and there are also bills being actively debated in Congress right now. So what I wanted everyone to weigh in first is where they think this is going to go. What is going to be likely action for trying to price carbon emissions in the near future? What is that system going to look like, and what are going to be the implications for equity in that design of the system that may come about? And you're just to my right. So
oh, you're pointing to me?
Volunteers.
Well, first of all,
actually, I know Adam has an answer, so maybe we will start with Adam.
Well, if I'm not too worn down from these, I just took part in one of these for an hour and a half yesterday, and I've got two next week. But in a nutshell, there's a couple of Senate bills being formed now, and they call for a limited cap and trade system on the power sector and some industrial sectors. And so you need allowances in order to emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and they are calling for an auction of those allowances, and that will raise the price of the products that need to purchase these. There's also a provision being touted now, and it's hard to believe from some standpoints, and that is a gasoline tax of as much as 15 cents a gallon. And it would be seen by most people as being regressive in terms of people at lower incomes having to spend a higher proportion of their income on transportation. So from that standpoint, it doesn't augur well from an equity standpoint. And again, for electricity is also potentially sort of regressive. The trick is what you do with the revenues that you receive from the auction or the tax. And that gives you the potential to do something to promote equity. In other words, you can give lower income groups, minority groups, from an environmental justice standpoint, potentially some favored treatment through tax credits and other mechanisms, for example. And the point is that the modern policy instruments, as opposed to regulation, incentive-based instruments, do allow you to address the equity issue head on by the redistribution, or what we call recycling, of the revenues that government receives from them.
And Chris, just to jump in California, our AB 32, our local cap and trade, the number I think folks in the room should have late in the afternoon is this will generate $20 billion a year in revenue from the utilities in California being in the cap and trade. I, as a public employee, thought that should go to the government to zero out our state deficit. Larry Goulder, a dream team of economists, and I'm not on this committee, what have they decided to do with the revenue? They're going to give it back to the people. And so in the case of, I was hoping you were going to cheer. In the case of California, if I am a lower middle income person, this could be a win. So an AB 32 with a cap and trade and rebate back to the people, if you have a small carbon footprint, if you wear a size 5 carbon shoe, you're going to get a net check here because of the choice of this Goulder committee. So coming back to what Adam said, it's crucial getting the incentive in place, generating the revenue, and then what you do with the revenue. And the Goulder committee has decided, and it may be partially a political decision, to give it back to the people.
I guess I'd like to put a couple of other issues on the table. And I think it's always important when you're trying to understand a system like this. But the system is very complex and very nonlinear. And it always involves not just policy, but it involves the economics and the fundamental structure of businesses that are supplying whatever it is, in this case energy, and also producing whatever it is you're trying to regulate, in this case carbon. It obviously also involves technology issues, which I think are important, and how you handle those, and then obviously environmental issues. These things are all tied together in energy. And when you grab and pull on one of them, like adding a carbon tax, something else happens in the system. Let me give you an example, and I think this is particularly important in the carbon issue, because I go back to, you said that the issue, the CO2 or GHG management is a common good or problem to be solved. Yeah, it is, but more than that, it's a global one. So but other aspects of this system are global too, and I think they're sometimes underestimated. Number one is capital. The capital investment that goes into the infrastructure that you're going to be taxing, it can move very easily as well. And one would ask, in the longer term, it won't happen instantaneously, but if you didn't have at least reasonably uniform global management of carbon price, would capital flows that result be even more damaging from a social justice point of view as jobs and opportunities flowed out of the high carbon price areas to others? And then there's always the question about whether solving social justice, a social justice equation satisfactorily in California results in a deterioration in the social justice system in interior China. Because the other thing. So I think one of the key questions as a practical matter is, as the energy supplier, one, why wouldn't they just pass on the cost? So it's not clear that in fact, my guess is, as we've seen with the recent battles with the DWP, they are in fact going to pass on the cost. So there is a question about how carbon pricing actually materializes for the lives of individuals.
Our comments did assume that those costs would be passed on to a great extent.
Right.
So we did factor that in.
Well, let me, if I may, enter this by expanding a little bit further, also responding first, though, to the fact that if we think about this around the theme of this day, which is the equity justice side, you come at this at a little different angle than the actually optimal, rational economic strategy of allocation to some extent. And frankly, when I had a conversation with students in our university about the cap and trade and the equity issue, they had a very quick solution
that really wasn't on my mind, but I thought I would share it with you because it's a generational and equity perspective that not all of us in the room may share, which is if there are going to be permits and they're going to be allocated under the cap and trade, would an equitable allocation be the same amount of permit to every person in the state of California? And the users enter a market to agglomerate those permits for purposes of emissions. So that in fact the equity issue was dealt with in one level by all peoples have an equal share in this process. When I, as the professor, followed up with, well, that makes some sense if you want to talk about it as an equity allocation system to start with as a beginning place. Another of the students objected and saying, well, we didn't mean to include you. What we were thinking of is inversely correlated with one's chronological age. In other words, those with the greatest interest are actually the younger, not us more senior. So what does equity mean in this context? Turned out to be not all that obvious. Second, the conversation that took place by our two economists, one was to being a good public servant working currently at a university institution of the state of California, was to return the money to the state budget for other notable, laudable public purposes.
My salary.
And the alternative being give it back to the people who pay, the taxpayers. There's actually a much more intensive conversation going on. Right. And those two are almost sideshows to the intensive conversation. There is another part of climate change which has to do with the unavoidable effects of climate change on our state that are going to occur no matter what we do in terms of mitigation, and the ranges of costs for adaptation in the state far exceed the amount of revenues from this anticipated revenue. So the equity justice issue is, what are you going to do if you live in a low floodplain in Oakland, California? And how is the state going to help you deal with your real world issues on the ground as sea level rises, as our distribution of water and water resources changes and so forth? So there are real equity in community situations that some are arguing we should use that money for that purposes, which was an equity purpose based on helping offset the true costs that are going to occur unavoidably as a consequence of climate change. So it seems to me this equity justice issue, I gave you just 3 different kind of cuts at it, really takes us in several different directions, aside from all the other complications that are normally talked about.
Chris?
Adam, yes.
At the risk of revealing my age and being further discriminated against, I'll mention that I've been at this for about 20 years, and I got thrown in the deep end when very few economists were involved by being part of a team to develop the first proposal for a system of globally tradable emission permits that we presented at the Rio Earth Summit in '92. And one of what I was charged with was examining the equity implications of that system. And I realized pretty early on, while economists tend to agree on what economic efficiency means, there's no consensus on what equity means. Yeah. And far be it from me at the time to say, hey, I've come up with the one best definition. And what I did was I went through the literature and adapted definitions from other contexts to the international domain and came up with 9 different equity criteria, and then the contribution was to look at the implications of all of them. But interestingly, the criterion that Dan mentioned is better known as the egalitarian criterion. And it basically it says every person on the planet has an equal right to pollute or to be free of pollution. And so basically you would allocate allowances or permits on the basis of population. And on the international scene, that is, what countries would you think would favor that? Well, China and India, obviously. But that's only one of 9, and one could probably say almost 20 different criteria. And it is probably something we might want to address for just a couple of minutes in terms of what do we really mean by equity, so we're not talking across each other. And, far be it from us to come up with the best definition, but maybe we can lay out a couple of definitions so the audience knows which one we're using. One of the good things about the early analyses were that philosophically, many of these criteria were different. There's what's called the Rawlsian Mazmanian that favors the poorest entity. The horizontal equity says you treat every country or entity equally. Vertical equity, where you try to narrow the gap between rich and poor. Consensus equity. There's even a notion called market justice, which says the market outcome is fair. You don't have to redistribute beyond that, and that's would be applied to an auction situation. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, whatever that market outcome is deemed fair. But one of the good things was that while many of these definitions differ philosophically, when you get down to applying them, the implications for who gains and who loses are quite narrow. The big outlier is the egalitarian, but many of the others group in the middle. And one of the reasons is there are three parts of the equation of net gains, who gains and who loses. There's the mitigation cost, and that the burden is typically focused on that. There is the purchases of allowances, and then there's the damage from greenhouse, from warming, and the saving of the damage. So no matter which of these criteria you put in for distributing the allowances, that doesn't affect the benefit side of the equation. And it also doesn't, by an arcane theorem of an economist, doesn't affect the mitigation side. It just really affects whether you're a permit purchaser or seller. And so what you have is several of these group, and we could debate the philosophical aspects of them all day, but they don't have much practical significant differences. But I do throw out that the egalitarian, while I've rarely ever seen it applied within a state and in this context, and it's novel, and the intergenerational aspect of that too. I give your students a lot of credit for imagination. It is the biggie on the international domain, and it's actually one of the things that's inhibiting us from getting agreement on a global climate treaty today. So it's big there. On the other hand, the horizontal, vertical equity, the simple ones, do we treat everybody equally? That's kind of superficial up front. Or do we try to give a little bit of favoritism to the lower income groups, or the two kind of prevailing approaches that we see in the U.S. when we talk about AB 32 or a national cap and trade system?
The one form of equity that you didn't mention in your list was some type of a conditional equity that some people, just because of their particular circumstances. So Dan mentioned people who live in the floodplains of Oakland. There'll also be people who live in particularly hot regions and so use a lot of electricity. There are people in the Midwest who are very dependent on coal, which is a high CO2 emitter. In what ways do creating pricing and creating a market treat these different regional variations inequitably? And which one of these should we be concerned about and try to address, and which ones are not viable? Like the one that I think that we could all agree is probably not viable is the person who bought a Hummer last year and decided, I don't want to have a gasoline tank tax because that would increase my gas bill much too much.
You're not sympathetic to that?
No.
So I really like your question. I think it's one about property rights. So when there's new news, I own a house in Westwood, and suppose that it turns out that my next door neighbor's house is a toxic dump, which is quite possible. We know from Zillow that the price of my house would plummet. I'm the next door neighbor of a dump. I'm a loser from this new news. Could I go? An interesting question is, do I have rights? So would my colleagues at UCLA laugh at me and say, we knew Khan was a sucker, and here's extra information? So there's new news. I'm the next door neighbor of a toxic waste dump. And my most valuable asset, my house, which is underwater, is worth less. To me, it's exactly like Chris's setup. If I consume a lot of electricity, and if I live in a coal-fired power plant area like a Missouri, under carbon pricing, I'm going to get a bigger carbon bill. Am I a victim? Or did I make a bet? During the Super Bowl, guys go to Las Vegas and make a bet. For the guys who voted, who won the Super Bowl this year? The Saints. For the guys who bet against the Saints, are they victims the day after the Super Bowl? Or when you lose a bet, you got to cover your bet. And I throw that out. I'm trying to be provocative late in the afternoon, but I'd like to hear what the panel says.
If I may, on the property rights, it may be a property right issue, but it's also an investment issue.
Yes.
And you can mention the stock market. If you buy a particular stock and it goes down, are we collectively obliged to help offset or compensate you for that loss? And we think about that differently, as it turns out, in practice, in real property, as opposed to other kind of equity issues. So as a society, we have FEMA and so forth that will come in and help you. So we actually do, as a society, treat different kinds of property differently in terms of our both explicit and implicit obligation to help you offset that bad choice. And actually, prior to the meeting, Chris sent us around a number of thoughtful questions, and if I may, it leads to the answer. My response to Chris's question, which is about this equity issue, if we have changed the rules of the game, what is our obligation? And my response, Chris, is the climate change is the new normal. And there are going to be enormous ramifications from accelerating climate change, for which we're only talking about one. And my personal response to that is that we aren't collectively obliged to make people whole as though there were not climate change in effect. So that leads us to say, well, given the change, what is our obligation, and especially at the equity and justice level? But I think we're all going to be paying more and doing things differently because of accelerating climate change. And I don't think we have a societal obligation to one another that compensate us as though we could ever take us back to that prior whole. That is basically the 20th century. It's behind us.
And one of the questions would be, as a practical matter, would you know really what to do? I mean, and especially since this will be a continuing series of events,
That's right.
with many of which will be probably surprises.
That's the new normal
Our
part.
ability to really understand the evolution of society in great detail over 20, 30, or 50 years is not very good. I would argue. But, this question about making people whole, I guess something just popped in my mind. Maybe it's a poor analogy, but when globalization destroyed what was at that time, it's kind of rebuilt itself in a different way, but destroyed at that time the U.S. steel business. What did we, did everybody step out and say, by God, Pittsburgh, we're going to? Are we going to step in and save Detroit? I mean, Detroit.
Well, yes, we did, in fact.
No, not the city of Detroit. And I think,
nor the city of Pittsburgh.
And so you had these, what were substantial shifts, and shifts well beyond, in many ways. You could say they screwed up by not doing A and B, but nonetheless, these were shifts that were beyond certainly the control of that locale, certainly beyond the control even of the United States. This was a shift in what happens in the world, and you go down because of it. Is this not similar?
I think it is similar.
And so then the question is, what do you do about that? You just say, well, you just take your chances, and the system moves itself around. One would argue, much as we're seeing in some parts of the economy today as a result of the Great Recession. I mean, there are pieces that will never come out looking the same.
Okay, but if we're having a shift that's reallocating property rights, reallocating, imposing
climate.
large costs broadly on society, are there particular segments of society that we still care about and that we want to protect from those shifts? And if so, how can they be protected within this framework?
Right, but I think but I think there is somewhat of a difference. In other words, that one may agree that you're going to do something about a particular group, as opposed to a very specific set of conditions.
Just as we talked about the possibility of retraining workers in some of those sectors, we may talk about how do you compensate the less well-off or help them through the transition really than compensate them, which is the way I personally look at that. And to what extent, by the way, the earlier conversations all touched on similar problems in terms of water, housing, transportation. How do you, if you're going to develop a strategy that ends up costing everybody more, but the least well-off are going to feel it the most, how do you then offset that to some extent? And I don't have a simple answer, pardon me, a complete answer, but I have a simple answer, which is not complete at all, but it is simple, which is, I think that our obligation as policy analysts is to think through what is the optimal collective strategy and then deal with the ramifications to the less well-off and build that into the policy. Now, I want to follow that for a moment, because I could see the fact is you don't want to use price signals and then say the least well-off financially aren't going to be susceptible to price signals. In other words, you've offset them. I would say what you want to do is you charge them whatever the prevailing fee is for that change, but then you do have a tax rebate, so they get cash back. But in fact, you haven't changed the price signals to them to change their behavior in terms of climate adaptation. But my problem with that is watching that over several decades, that's an often prescribed strategy and seldom implemented. So I'm very wary as a practical matter that theory, philosophical position, is embraced politically in the society very often. So I'll caution about the simple solution.
To pick up on Dan's point and to mention Brad Pitt, there is an architect terrific at non sequiturs. There is an architect at UCLA who has come out with a $180,000 home. And this home has a special feature that he wants to sell in New Orleans. It's a floating home, such that when the next Katrina occurs, you can ride it out like a surfer in this house. And Brad Pitt and he are getting ready to sell this. And so coming to Dan's point, two of Dan's points, will different groups be able to adapt to climate change differently? And if the poor don't have $180,000 or the new leveraged down payment to finance for these homes, Matt Kahn might be able, if I move to Tulane, might be able to surf it out in this home. But if there's someone poor who's my next door neighbor who could not have a similar home, what are their rights? And to a political scientist, what would be the right public policy here if we wanted this product to diffuse widely to make Brad Pitt happy? And I do think it would protect us from risk if we were all in these in New Orleans. What is the right public policy in that case?
Yeah. You're asking, I don't have an answer, but I immediately came to mind is cash for clunkers. You know, we thought of ways of getting people to buy cars pretty quickly as well, the question is a subsidy of some sort. If you think that the collective good is to have everybody in a floatable house in New Orleans, some can afford it in the market and others can't, there is a subsidy strategy or a discounted mortgage strategy or a variety of ways that we do already to get people into homes and so forth. But you don't have to go to New Orleans. I think that house is going to be necessary in the delta of our own state pretty soon because of both climate change and seismic behavior and the current particular characters we're in. But that's another story.
Let me just interject something about pricing. We're talking a lot about raising prices as if to suggest prices are going up, but we need to realize from the standpoint of economics, many of the prices we're talking about are artificially low now from one perspective. In other words, they don't represent the full social costs of the resources involved. In other words, there are what economists call externalities, and that's the costs we impose on others when we drive our car and generate pollution or flip the switch and generate electricity. So it's not so much that we're being mean and raising prices to unreasonable levels. Another perspective is that prices are, as I said before, artificially low, and we're getting them up to where they should be. So the onus shouldn't be so much on necessarily avoiding raising prices, and I commend Dan for an excellent political science explanation of what economists often say as well, and that is the best solution, whether you're from the right or the left, and we've got one of each here as economists, most economists agree on this, and that is prices, the market works best when prices are allowed to find their appropriate level, and reflect the value of resources. And it's best not to meddle with those except where there's a failure, and then you get the prices up by some artificial means, but use a secondary policy to handle inequities. You don't try to do it with pricing alone. That's too ham-fisted an approach to dealing with the problem.
Now, this morning I did a quick back of the envelope or on the internet calculation, found that our annual, in the United States we have about 6 billion tons of CO2 emissions a year, and I saw a couple estimates of between $10 and $80 for an emissions permit for that. So my questions are: is this $50 billion to $400 billion figure right for the added tax that's going to be imposed on the economy? And if it is, who's going to be paying it? Or is there a reason to believe that these numbers are much too high or much too low?
No, those numbers are on the mark.
They're in range. Yeah.
The denominator, though, I believe we're a $7 or $10 trillion economy. And so
I can't remember what you. Oh, yeah, the U.S. GDP is 14 trillion.
And so, Chris, I do agree with your numbers, and I think that brings us back to Don's point of pricing carbon, and I'm a full fan of incentives and sending the right signals, but it is not a free lunch, and there will be costs associated with tackling this problem. And so I think the big debate going on in California is this Schumpeter debate on job creation versus job destruction.
Yeah.
And I do believe, and Don took us an important direction in his first remarks, if I'm an energy intensive firm in California,
They're gone already?
I'm going to suffer under this new regulatory regime. So Don, I'll let you right in. The one point I would make, and then I'll stop. There are firms that will gain from carbon regulation that currently don't exist. And so I'm very interested in the asymmetry that the losers from pricing the externality have every incentive to make their victimhood heard. But there are winners solar companies, the next Prius, who don't even exist yet, who don't have a seat at the table to lobby. But Don?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It's like all the changes we're talking about, that they are in a system as even though this amount, you would argue, well, gee, we're only talking about a fairly modest percentage of GDP. On the other hand, you're still talking about anything more than 1% or so is not a modest effect, as you all know, and especially if it gets concentrated into certain sectors. But it's like all these changes, because the system, again, is interconnected, it involves multiple dimensions, economics, science, policy, and so forth, that it will induce shifts in the system. And what is very difficult to predict is how those shifts will occur. You're talking about California. California already has anomalously high electric prices compared to the U.S., among the top ones, for reasons that many Californians will say is perfectly good. It has certainly introduced a higher level of efficiency into the California system than really almost anywhere else in the United States. An efficiency level that looks more like many areas in Europe or Japan. On the other hand,
And an alternative energy portfolio.
for those who grew up in California, I grew up in Southern California, we used to have steel mills, aluminum mills, we used to make automobiles, cement, oil and gas, we still have a little bit of that. Energy intensive industries don't live in California unless they simply can't uproot and go. And so the question you have to ask yourself as you do this, energy intensive industries will move. They will move somewhere. It's interesting to note, as somebody mentioned Missouri, it's coal. You can go to any of the states that have very modest prices of electricity, especially for industrial consumers. And there are steel mills, and there are aluminum plants, and there are all of these. And so the question about getting back to our key point here is what happens to the fabric of employment opportunities in this social equity issue, which ultimately has got to be in the equation. What do those look like in an economy which has almost no industrial base? Or you argue about creating new ones, but we have a very modest industrial base compared to what we used to. There's a big difference between jobs that pay $35 or $40 an hour, like a unionized industrial plant worker, versus somebody who's installing solar panels if you go to at $12 an hour. So I think it's some of those effects that will show up. Now, I'm not smart enough to predict what they'll be, but anybody that consumes a lot of energy, without a doubt, is going to be looking for another place to go.
Can I just say a follow-up on that? Now, you posed a question which is not uncommon, which you've calculated the near-term first-order costs as can be calculated based on the use of coal and greenhouse gas burning. But of course, what Don's talking about and what Matt was talking about was part of this is about equity and justice, but it's intergenerational, which is one of the benefits of the converted, once we've been through the transition, that new energy regime. Right. And there is a huge intergenerational equity issue, which goes back to my students telling me that they didn't have in mind I would have a fair share of that, an equal share of that permit. Because in fact, it's the future generations that can either suffer or benefit the most. Our problem, of course, as Don said at least 6 times already, we don't really know what that looks like yet. Right. And so it is, we know what the immediate cost is and the pain will be, it's easier to identify. We are imagining what that future is going to look like, and all we'll know about it from this perspective is it will be less greenhouse generating gases, which is, of course, the whole conversation is around to what extent we're going to moderate the accelerating rise in climate change. That itself is going to have a whole host of ramifications and impacts on us that aren't even at the table.
You know, there's a very interesting specific example around carbon pricing, and of course it's in the middle of the political debate, but I'll set all of that aside. Think about coal. The U.S. is the second largest coal producer in the world. It has the largest reserve basin. It has, in the Powder River Basin, particularly in western Wyoming, probably the premier coal deposit on the planet. I think if you talk to any utility, I was over at the DWP today, and the DWP, by the way, has 40% coal. Less than the U.S. average, but high for the West, which is one of the reasons why they say we have low electric rates. But as they say, we are going to drive out of that system. In fact, the mayor has made that a political pledge. So the U.S. is, without a doubt, shrinking from its 50% coal power dependency. And it's going to shrink. And any utility you talk to is basically going to do it. So you're going to lose, so those jobs are going to get converted to something. Maybe they get converted to gas plants or something else. But the irony of this, actually, is what happens to the coal business? We're producing more coal than ever, so what's happening? In fact, the DWP went in, part of the reason, legitimately, for their rate increase was the fact that coal prices are rising. So we're shrinking coal plants, coal prices are rising. Why? The U.S. is on its way to being the Saudi Arabia of coal. The U.S. is on its way to being the largest coal exporter on the planet. So all these coal mines have now actually, they're going to ship it. They're going to ship it to Canada, to the aluminum plants. They're going to ship it to China. So this is an example of where you squeeze on the thing. Now, in this particular case, actually, the coal mining business, that was one of the great worries, right? That the coal mining business, nah, that's not going to happen. Coal mining business is going to be just fine. They're just going to be shipping the coal out instead of consuming it here. Fine from a jobs point of view, dubious from a carbon management point of view. So I think this is another example of how it's very difficult to push on the system and have something and have it all come out the way we're talking about. But there's an example of where, in a very strange way, a carbon tax might actually increase employment in the coal business by driving an export market that pays more for U.S. coal than U.S. power plants are willing to pay.
Another unanticipated consequence.
My only counter, and Don is an excellent economist, I don't need the competition, but his point about leakage is very important. The optimist, and I'm eternally too optimistic, would be if the U.S. takes this leadership role seriously. There's a question right now among green economists about learning by doing. If the U.S. takes the lead on carbon, of decarbonizing our economy, our inventions, our next Googles, we can export those to China and India. And so I agree with Don that under current technologies, we will start to export our coal. But if we can, in a globalized world, ideas are the ultimate public good. And if we can perfect certain technologies, that those ideas can diffuse across borders. And so that's my only smart counter to your very nice point.
Well, and that too. I mean, if you look, the fact that the world's going to need 50% more energy than it's got now, based surely on growth in population, growth in global GDP, and a continuing improvement in efficiency, 50% more, you're going to need all of the above. There isn't going to be enough to do this. It was interesting, before I came here, I had a meeting with the leader of technology at BMW, and their projections for India and China automobiles are just breathtaking, I guess is the only thing I could say. I mean, they're talking about global automobile production rising from 50 million vehicles a year approaching 100 million. And so if that growth in China, India, Asia is going to double the number of automobiles, so all these resource issues, I think are part of this issue. Now, one could argue that all this growth has got to be good from the point of view of opportunities from a social equity point of view, not only in the U.S. but in the growing economies. So I think maybe that's the interaction you really one of the ones you have to talk about. High growth rates is generally going to be good from a social equity point of view. If you put at what price of carbon do you dampen that growth rate sufficiently that you take something else out? I mean, I don't know what the answer is.
You came up with a couple of examples of geographical disparities. If you regulate here in California, you may drive business outside of California. If you regulate, if we do increase the cost of carbon here in the United States, that may drive coal exports. Given that this is a global problem and that reductions in greenhouse gases in any part of the world benefit the entire world, right. What are the equity implications of the current regional strategies where we have efforts in Europe and in parts of the United States, but we haven't been able to piece together a global system on doing this? Do we need to go global to make the benefits from pricing carbon both efficient, effective, and equitable?
I think without a doubt, if you don't have a global framework now, does that mean identical? Probably, maybe not. But some structure that is compatible is an absolute requirement. The question that I think is beginning to surface as we're seeing all of these things is what's Plan B? What happens if you don't get that agreement? For lots of reasons you can imagine you might not.
Plan B is adaptation.
And then, and I think that was where it was going to go. Does that have a different set of characteristics?
Qualitatively different.
On the social equity front than the issue of the direct impacts of pricing a carbon management system? So in other words, at which point do you decide Plan B is what you've got, and therefore now you need to begin to trigger different issues on social equity than Plan A?
Okay.
Adam.
I'll just interject. Dan's the expert on adaptation, but it strikes me, let me just interject one thing early on with regard to a global agreement. Remember, climate change is a global problem, and the only way we're going to solve it is really with a truly global agreement, number one. Second is we talked a little bit about cap and trade before, and the best way to bring down the cost of dealing with the problem is by getting more countries involved, because all the countries that are out there that aren't in the agreement now have a lot of low-cost mitigation options that we can bring into place. So study after study shows the more countries you get involved, the lower the average mitigation cost is going to be. Now, with respect to adaptation, and earlier we said on the mitigation side, you do have a pretty easy way to address equity issues head-on, and that is by the redistribution or recycling of the auction revenues and the carbon taxes. With adaptation, I don't think you've got as much flexibility. I think you're stuck a little more.
You have more costs and very few revenue streams.
Right.
Less
And so it's a tougher game.
Can I go back to your question about this global scale? We have a mismatch in the scale of the problem and the jurisdiction of our political entities. And we know that. And COP15 strikes me as made very clear the at least dominant response to that, which is I don't believe the OECD countries plus China and maybe a couple others are ever going to sign on to a greenhouse gas cap strategy for the very reason in terms of source. That is, the United States, we're consuming 20% of the globe's resources now, and it's not likely from a political point of view that our political leaders are going to agree to anything that the southern nations believe is equitable and fair in terms of the redistribution of consumption. So it's just very hard politically. So the outcome that we had out of COP15 was, rather than pledge to a cap, we've pledged to alternative energy at an accelerating rate. And it seems to me politically that is viable, but it doesn't get us to a global accord on the cap of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're basically in a foot race as a global community of the rate at which particulates in the greenhouse gas emissions are rising, beyond which point they're going to wreak havoc globally. They're already doing it locally. And our ability to rein that in, but we're not prepared politically to rein it in through a cap. And that's the catch-22. We'll say, we'll do it through alternative technologies, which is hopeful, which we are funding, which includes, for those who aren't happy about it, nuclear power in the United States and elsewhere. So that all these things are moving at the same time outside of, I think, the practical ability to have a global governance on greenhouse gas emissions. Which is why I said adaptation, because we're going to live with the consequences of that. And back to that very quickly, I don't want to go into detail here particularly, but for Californians, the way to think about this issue is mitigation has to do with air, and adaptation has to do with water. That is, mitigation is emitting greenhouse gases, but adaptation is all going to be around water in this state. Both water rising as in sea level rise, and the very dramatic change in our internal a plumbing system, that is availability of potable water and how we use it.
Before I open it up to the audience, let's end with the institutional question. You voiced broad agreement on this idea that let the market set a price for carbon, and then we can deal with equity through different mechanisms. So one option is to auction off the emission permits and then redistribute that amount of money. Another one was that Dan had mentioned would be still even for the very poor, make them pay whatever is the new price for energy, but then subsidize them in some other ways. One of the aspects...
I third, if I will, Dan,
okay.
I said distribute those permits equitably across the citizenry.
I was just about to get there.
I've gone.
Okay, and then there's the whole question. But then there's the political economy questions. Really, what is the set of institutions that you trust most, that over a long period of time, because that this market has to be maintained over a long period of time, will be able to take those considerations into account and protect these horizontal and vertical and other equity interests that we may wish to protect over the long time. So you agree with the general public and have very low trusts of all political institutions.
You let the equity allocation be managed through eBay?
Everybody gets one, and then you just trade them.
Hey.
Okay.
You asked. Remember, my mantra is KISS, keep
Well,
it
more
simple.
specifically,
But you raise an extremely important point, which tends to get skipped over, although everybody knows it. And that is that this system, to have any chance of affecting the CO2 concentration at the magnitude that it has to, which is enormous, we basically have to remove 1 trillion tons of CO2, tons of CO2 over the next several generations, a huge number, okay? You have to stay at it for a period of time in which very few things have ever been able to be managed. And that's one of the challenges for a good in which you're asking political entities basically to manage it. Because political entities can change that distribution at some point in time for other reasons that you may not have even seen yet, aside from the normal political. So I think the time frame, and when you think about this institution, I think I would agree with you. I think that's the number one question. What can be put in place to manage something of this magnitude over generations?
Okay, KISS 2. Don raises a very important point. I'm thinking if you actually allocated out permits and had them aggregated on a continuous basis through auction and so forth, Social Security's done that for now 70 years. It's running into some rough spots in terms of available money, but not the administration of collecting and allocating out checks.
Okay, that's an example. Maybe that's how you have to do it. But it has to be something that is...
I said eBay, but it would be the public regulated eBay.
But Social Security, as you pointed out before, is also a relatively simple, straightforward system.
You've got to look for it simple and straightforward, or it's not going to work.
Okay, well, let's open it up to the audience for questions.
More about this than anybody here.
Yes, and then we'll go back here to you.
Thanks. Kind of connecting this discussion to the earlier discussions, most of what we've talked about so far in the past hour is focused on single source pollution. And I'm not an environmental economist, so I don't know the share of total greenhouse gases from different sources, but presumably some portion of that comes from auto emissions, some portion from inefficient buildings, poor management of building resources. So I wonder if you could comment on kind of an optimal strategy for pricing these different sources. Congestion taxes we've already kind of talked about, but encouraging more retrofit and upgrading of the existing housing stock seems to be would generate a lot of improvements as well. So just comments on that.
Let me make one comment on the mitigation cost side. I work with an NGO called the Center for Climate Strategies, and CCS has facilitated stakeholder groups in 16 states in the development of climate action plans. And what they do is get people sitting around the table from all segments of society, including many technical experts, to identify options to mitigate greenhouse gases and to assess their feasibility and their costs. And state after state, they have found and identified many low-cost and even cost-saving options. So we've talked a lot about the cost burden, but there is increasing sentiment there that there is a lot of low-hanging fruit, that there are a lot of cost-saving options. Even a friend of ours at Stanford, who used to be fairly conservative in this sense, has developed a center on energy efficiency, and now he's even admitting and realizing this. So it's not all, there are some win-win aspects of this too. It's not all a matter of trade-offs or a negative image.
Well, reducing energy intensity broadly, or raising energy productivity, whichever way you want to look at that, is, that's clearly going to have lots of advantage points, particularly as energy becomes more expensive by whatever means, either because of availability or because of availability plus the price of carbon. So energy efficiency, reducing energy intensity, productivity, those are all, and I think many people are coming to that conclusion. So that's clearly going to be advantageous. The only problem with all of that, and in fact, even arguably, that's what the Chinese had said, we'll do that. We will move our energy intensity, the energy use per unit of output, down to the curve you're on.
That's the COP agreement.
I think you could get an agreement from virtually every country on Earth to agree to energy intensity reduction as an agreement. The problem comes that when you put it all together and you do whatever reasonable set of curves you think you might have, you're not anywhere near the ballpark, because it's hard to outrun the growth in GDP. And so I think that's ultimately, clearly for advanced societies, selling the message of energy efficiency and reducing energy intensity, that's a winning strategy, and I think a lot of people buy in. I think, and obviously you can do that, and you have to do that too. I think this is, the problem here is the question you always have, but then what? And I think it's the but then what is what.
So at the California Air Resources Board, they point to smog in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
They say we're driving ever more miles, but Jim Morrison wouldn't recognize the smog if he were to come back from the 1970s. And so emissions per mile of driving has fallen so much faster than miles have driven. Total emissions is the product of the two.
Yeah.
And so when the optimists at the Air Resources Board say, we've done it before and we can do it again, we can sing that song together. So Don is right. But the regulators, and this may be convenient, have convinced themselves that we have a track record that we can have the win-win of economic growth, but technique greening so fast to overcompensate. But Don has posed the right challenge, but we have one optimistic data point of past progress against local air pollution.
I don't think there's any question. You're going to be better. The world is going to be clearly have lower carbon intensity continuously. I think the real challenge you have is when people start talking about 90% reductions, I think that's where the challenge is going.
Right, but that's not until 2050, and we are talking about ramping up and not jumping right into that. And I think we have to realize we are not locked in forever. That we're talking about a long time horizon, and that cuts a couple of different ways. But one is, we've got opportunities to do adjustments. If we're on the path to economic cataclysm, we're not going to keep driving down that road. We're going to hold up a little, and it'll be an interesting balance to see which outpaces which. The damages from climate change outpacing any sort of negative impacts down the road. The other thing, the thing we haven't brought up the long time horizon earlier, is it does come into play in an important way. We're used to talking about short-run problems, relatively speaking, to this. And we've talked about essentially sunk costs, or we've talked about coal miner jobs from the non-investment standpoint. But we are talking about a greater awareness that we've got a problem, we've got to deal with it. It's a 40-year, 100-year problem. And while I'm sympathetic to helping compensate people in the next 10 years, I'm less sympathetic to compensating them 20 or 30. I mean, how many people are really going to invest in coal mines right now, sort of a long run? I know
China.
You've made a good point. I think that even China's got the local air pollution problems, and I don't know the numbers maybe as well as you. I'm a little concerned about how that being over-optimistic, but maybe I picked the wrong example. But there are obviously some long-term losers. And somebody who's investing in those long-term losers has nobody but himself to blame. In other words, I'm sympathetic about helping the coal miner who's going to be out of a job, assuming I'm right for a moment, in the next 10 years, but I wouldn't be very sympathetic if he encouraged his son to go in the coal mine.
Well, coal maybe is too specific an
yeah,
example,
it
because
is, but
when
like
people
the-
think coal mines, they think about the disaster in West Virginia.
Yeah,
That's
it's not all
5% of
underground.
U.S. coal mining.
Right,
That's
right,
not
right.
the future.
Well, you know,
So
there-
that will solve itself.
Yeah. There are two wild cards here. They're not necessarily equity issues per se, but we talk about them. One is carbon capture and storage, which
right.
is really going to make a big difference. The other is nuclear power, which does have equity, environmental justice issues to some extent, but
I think the nuclear power, and it's just obviously you thought about this. If you take a country that is basically 100%, for all practical purposes, dependent on it, a little bit of gas, France.
yeah.
How do they address this? And certainly you're talking about a very egalitarian society. So how did they balance this?
Oh, the origins of that?
Well, no, I'm just
So-
saying is, what would be your assessment of the social equity in a place like
Oh.
France that is basically all nuclear power and clearly has a highly
Right, an egalitarian, not by virtue of the before tax situation, but by virtue of them being more of a welfare state than we are. In other words, if you look at the before tax income distribution, I doubt if it's that much better than the U.S.
But after tax, it's
France,
different.
but after tax, because, you know.
But is the issue with nuclear power in the U.S., is it a siting issue? Is it a cost issue? What is the issue?
Yeah, I brought that up. I don't have a great, you know, there are a lot of issues with regard to, let's say, manufacturing plants, especially with dealing with toxics that have environmental justice aspects because of the locational consideration. Whether you're on the left or the right on this, it is sort of a locational thing, and the outcome is there are disadvantaged groups, poor and minorities. Nuclear power's contamination zone or plume is much broader. I think that's the scarier thing there. So it's a little bit less of a localized environmental justice issue off the top of my head. But I don't know, do people have some ideas about equity aspects of nuclear power? Good
How
or
would you
bad?
argue, if you were going to make an argument for if a new nuclear power plant was going to be sited, how would you phrase the environmental justice argument one way or the
Yeah,
other?
well, the only way I've thought about this, why can't we build these plants where people don't live? You know, we've improved our ability to transmit this stuff. We don't have to build them on beautiful beaches.
You need to
And,
find
the middle of
a
Long
very
Island.
You
available
need
water
You
source,
need
which
water.
sounds like a
You
beach
need
to
water
me.
and lots of it.
You need lots of water.
Yeah.
Lots of water.
But France, very interestingly, has I don't know how many that they have, but this is a very densely populated country
Right.
Yes.
that is able to situate them
Yes.
all
yeah,
over
throughout-
the place.
throughout the countryside.
And being half French, I've spent a lot of time in France. I've never seen one. While you see when you go down to San Diego, it's very evident where the American ones are.
You can see them when you fly over France.
Well, Chris, you said.
You got a question out here.
Okay.
Let's get the audience
So
here.
back there, do we have a microphone? Why don't we?
I see two
please,
questions back
Oh,
here.
you go first. Go right ahead.
The example about coal exports moving, or our coal production moving from domestic to exports, raises a broader issue that's been a kind of a nightmare to me, and I wondered if any of you would like to comment on it. And that is, everything that we do in terms of public policy, these hard-fought battles like to raise the CAFE standards and national standards, or California's efforts to reduce petroleum consumption and coal consumption, especially on environmental grounds, all of those, of course, are leaving in the ground a valuable resource somewhere, and including some very, very dirty ones like tar sands and oil shale, which there are a few countries that have tremendous wealth, potential wealth there that they're going to guard. U.S. is one of them. So I'm wondering whether each of these efforts that we make is actually going to just postpone carbon emissions to some other time, perhaps some other place, as the world works through these markets and its inability to come up with a really tight policy to control them.
Well, there's a good question. If you want to talk about, take the Alberta tar sands. It's just particularly I think, a particularly relevant argument because we're only at the beginning of this thing. For those who don't know, this is probably by itself one of the world's largest hydrocarbon resource bases. I mean, it is immense. It is of the scale of Saudi Arabia. It happens to be next door to one of the world's largest markets, so there's that issue. The second issue is it happens to be in the one province in Canada that basically has a political viewpoint that is always been, Alberta has been built on natural resource development. I mean, it is the Texas of Alberta. And then the recent developments, which I think are significant, you have seen American companies, for various reasons, many of them straight up business decisions, like ConocoPhillips, recently sell out of their positions. Who bought them? Chinese National Petroleum Company, of course. China is accumulating a major position. They will probably be in the end, one of the largest owners of this resource. Now, it's hard to imagine that they've pumped $20 billion over time into this resource, and then they're going to say, bye. So I think this issue and how, now, will carbon get priced in Canada? I think so. So what's that tell you? What the bet there is, for those who are in it, like Syncrude, which is the biggest Canadian company that's in there, Suncor rather, their view is the technology will outrun the carbon pricing. That's their view.
The carbon capturing?
Or you make them, you can produce it carbon-free if you use nuclear energy to do it. So, so their view is that this is, first off, this is a century-scale resource. It isn't going to go away, and they're going to grind away on it. So I think it's these kinds of things, as you say, that these big resources, that those who need them, or those who feel they got to at least have them in the bank account, in case they do need them, like China, those things are going to move themselves around the system. Their distribution on the planet could very well be affected by the carbon policies. But it's hard to imagine they aren't going to actually acquire them. So, I think it's a great question, and how do national or international governments regulate that process without basically ultimately going to where nations control all the resources and therefore can govern these resources by political process. Right now, these resources are owned by private entities.
So Canada may nationalize that eventually. Huh?
Yeah, but then the question you ask is, can Canada, which is an export economy, always has been, natural resource economy, always has been, little population, say, why would we give up $10 trillion in value? Why in the earth would we do this? And or maybe they would come and say, okay, U.S., we'll do it. You give us $3 trillion to stay out of the business.
Well, there is a little bit of an equity issue in Canada. It's more of a federalist system, more like a sort of states' rights system than
Very
the
much
U.S.
so, very much
So
so.
that
It's
in the
Confederacy.
U.S., in the U.S., there's so many federal lands, and royalties tend to go to the federal government. In Canada, the provinces.
The provinces
So
collect
you
it
can
all.
imagine a situation where the other provinces gang up on Alberta, and we've talked about Quebec separatism, I think.
Well, then Alberta
The stars and bars
Alberta is
will
the
be flying
one
in
province
Edmonton.
that actually could probably go on its own because
Right.
it has the resources and it has whatever that $1 trillion endowment fund in the bank.
Here, we first had Prisma, and then we'll move over to you.
You got
Let's go back to her.
I wanted to go back to the issue of environmental justice and ask the panel about the best carbon pricing model that can deal with the localized impacts of energy production, or if there is a carbon pricing model that can. I took my class on Toxic Tour of East LA with Communities for a Better Environment, go down Alameda Corridor and the ports, and you see communities that, right in the bedroom of oil refineries that are gas flaring. And same in Niger Delta, I work with one of the field sites I work in is in the Niger Delta, and huge environmental devastation, both air quality, water quality, by oil refineries. If you tax production, they'll move elsewhere to one of these other communities, and if you introduce caps, maybe some companies are able to afford to buy the right to pollute and pollution is intensified locally. So what does the panel feel about that? Thank you.
Well, the environmental justice aspects are one of the Achilles heels of cap and trade from two standpoints. One is ordinary pollutant, well, let's say greenhouse gases are globally mixed, which means no matter where you emit them or clean them up, you benefit everybody in the world. It doesn't matter if you do the cleanup in LA or Montreal or in the Arctic Circle somewhere. And so a business in LA can simply buy allowances and keep polluting, and there'll be a reduction, but it'll be elsewhere. So that's not a problem from greenhouse gases, but it is with respect to co-pollutants, the local
Criteria
pollutants.
emissions.
Yeah.
Particulates and sulfur
Ambient air
dioxide.
quality.
So that's a problem for cap and trade. And then the other part is you're also not investing in the community. In other words, if it were simply buying a scrubber, then you'd need local construction companies to come in and you'd be spending some money locally, but if you buy the allowance, the emission reduction is taking place elsewhere. So on both ends, you wind up with an environmental justice issue there. So it's tough, but again, the redistribution, the recycling of the tax revenue can help, and otherwise, or some initiative that tries to capture replacement jobs in some way might work. But it is a thorny issue.
But I think your question really raises what I think is a very important construct that people need to think about, and that is that the CO2 emissions that comes from energy use, or at least petroleum-based energy use, and the question of local criteria emissions that either come from, living next to a freeway or living next to refining, those are really distinctive issues and really require different kinds of solutions. First off, one is immediate and local, period. CO2 emission issue is not immediate and it's not local. It's the cumulative effect of CO2 that does you in, not. So I think it's a very important question, and I think when it comes to things like refineries, we're going to get a chance to see how this plays out, because I think we're into the U.S. oil consumption has probably peaked for all time, and you're going to see a major restructuring of the U.S. refining business. So they're going to start closing some refineries in the U.S. Many people would argue that there's probably 30% too much refining capacity. So that issue is going to show up. You're going to get real live experiments where the refining system gets reduced by 30%. Which ones close? How does that play to the social justice issue? Do you close the worst polluting ones, the old grungy ones, although most of those are pretty small, but do you close those, which reduces that emission? Then of course everything else goes away with it, or not? I think that will be that'll be a real test of your intelligence about how you manage this social justice issue in the face of when in fact people are going to close refineries. And what does that do to the local community?
Now, Adam, in the when people write about emissions trading for these criteria pollutants and try to bring in these locational aspects into the trading scheme, that the complexity of the system really increases exponentially. And in reclaim, for example, the amount of trades, for the way I understand, the amount of trades have been really reduced because there's been some effort of not moving all of the emitters into East LA in the most impoverished. And so are those constraints also going to build up for the types of trades that we allow for greenhouse gases? And will that act as a similar constraint on the ways
again, purely on a greenhouse gas basis, you wouldn't need them. But the danger is that things you're doing and decisions you're making with respect to greenhouse gases might cause a problem. But if you have actually a combination of a cap and trade for the greenhouse gas and the criteria pollutants, you can solve that to a great extent. And that's not unreasonable.
And currently, we have both systems.
Right.
They are separate systems
Right,
currently.
right.
Separate systems.
With a guy in the green shirt.
Okay, right over here.
Gentlemen, I'd like to ask you a practical political question. The United States does not have an energy policy at this moment in terms of a cap and trade system or a carbon tax system. Congress can't seem to get its act together to adopt a comprehensive approach to this problem. And California, we can pat ourselves on the back and say we've done a good job with our climate legislation, but there's a proposal, an initiative being circulated to essentially repeal, not repeal it in totality, but effectively prevent its implementation until unemployment in California is at 5.5%. So are we getting a little ahead of ourselves in this conversation? Because there seems to be some very heavy pushback, both in Sacramento and in Washington, that hasn't gotten us to the kinds of systems that you're talking about this afternoon.
Well, we had a session yesterday in SPPD, and a couple of people pointed out, I think, that we have an opportunity with this Congress to potentially pass some climate legislation. The next Congress probably will not be so sympathetic to doing that. And I would say that the recent pushback is primarily due to the poor state of the economy, which is not a permanent phenomenon. The other thing I've mentioned, from an academic standpoint, again, giving away my age, every year I notice my students are a little greener than the year before. I mean that in terms of environmentally sensitive. And my point would be, if you had a good economy and the 2000 election would have been held in 2012, I'm sure Al Gore would have been elected, just because of the demographic shifts you see. And you see that in other countries. Remember that the Prime Minister of Norway, as early as 1990, was the previous environmental minister of that country. And I think that's a trend. So, yeah, I think we've got a situation where we're taking 2 steps forward and there's going to be a step back, and the pendulum swinging. We had all this momentum on the Western Climate Initiative. The last 2 entrants in the Western Climate Initiative were Quebec and Ontario. That's how far flung the sort of momentum got. But Arizona last month just dropped out.
Right.
Utah's likely to drop out. But I see that as just a bump in the road, not any permanent roadblock.
I would tend to agree that is clearly the long-term trend. Now, the question whether there's something else that will get in the way, and clearly the Great Recession has gotten in the way. I mean, it's had a big effect. I wouldn't underestimate. There is an issue in the U.S., and I think it's another thing, and maybe it's a short-term hiccup that will play itself out, but this is a super regionalized issue. This issue, if you think about an active view about greenhouse gas management, it is primarily, not exclusively, but is primarily driven by the Northeast corridor in New England and the West Coast. There are vast swaths of the Midwest and the South that say, we're not interested. So how, in fact, that it's viewed as a form of basically imperialism, because since we're dependent on coal, you're going to raise our prices to the level of California and New York. Our economic advantage is that we've got 5 cents a kilowatt of power. So I think the regionalism is one of the backdrops that's got to play out against this undoubted trend of greenness. I mean, and so is this a short-term thing that will accommodate itself in some reasonable fashion? I think that remains to be seen. It's hopefully that there will be an accommodation as opposed to places simply like some of the things we've seen with states taking on the laws, unconstitutional states having actually proclaimed that they won't enforce the law. So,
Let me just say, I think that what you've heard is probably quite reasoned idea, and in fact, we may be in a slight setback over a long-term trend, and I'm a believer in that long-term, but I'm not a believer in it because Reggie exists or the culture of environment on the West Coast. I'm actually a believer of it because I happen to believe that the accelerating climate change is having enormous ramifications for all of us, and so another way of reflecting on the possibility of more abrupt and dramatic movements will unfortunately, if it occurs, follow the path of other dramatic and abrupt policy changes, which is they follow crisis.
Right.
So that if you want, if you will, it's called, they call themselves the canary in the climate change tunnel. Watch Australia, because they believe they are the canary right now in terms of some of these heat rise, precipitation change, and dramatic policy responses. That's the way they characterize themselves, and for a variety of reasons, the southern half of California has the same kind of climactic conditions, except we're in the northern half of the atmosphere. So there's every reason to believe that we may experience a comparable sort of jolt to the system. But aside from a jolt to the system, I think that if the climate science is correct in the long-term trend, you will see these changes. It's only a matter of when.
Going back to the numbers I talked about better, creating property rights and emissions creates something that's valued in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year. That's both a political opportunity and a political problem. The opportunity comes is that in the distribution of all of these rights, there is a way to overcome a lot of the political impediments. I think that I would predict a very messy type of hard bargaining in politics on how this climate change would come out, and that's why it always looks very iffy about something like this would pass. We did pass the 1990 Clean Air Act, which created a similar system for sulfur dioxide, and again, there the distribution of those permits for doing it was a very messy, very political process, and they ended up going primarily to coal-producing states in the Midwest because those were the people who were going to be harmed most by this policy, and they wanted to mitigate that harm. That's why we hire politicians, is to make the difficult possible, and let's see if they can do it. Any other questions? Because otherwise I think we've run out of time, and I'd like to, if you could give a round of applause for our speakers.